you doing out there?
I'm gonna jump. There's nothing to live for.
Get back in here. Let's talk about it. Next on the Growthbusters podcast, I'll try to talk my co-host off the ledge after the election of Donald Trump.
Calling. Call the Growthbusters. Whoa.
Let me tell you, that was the worst Taco Tuesday of my whole life. We had the choice between a prosecutor and a criminal, and we chose the criminal to be president.
It's official. America's elected its first criminal president before electing its first female president. What a day for proud felonists. What the actual America?
We'll get into that on the first episode of Growthbusters in 9 months.
Wow, 9 months. Hard to believe I've missed you in the podcast department, Stephanie.
I've missed you too, but you've been doing something pretty important out there, right?
That's right. But first, let's introduce ourselves. I'm Dave Gardner. I am co-host of the Growthbusters podcast, producer and director of the documentary Growthbusters, Hooked on Growth, and just all-around Growthbuster in chief.
And I'm Stephanie Gardner. I'm daughter of the Growthbusters Supreme, Dave Gardner, and I'm the Growthbusters podcast co-host. And I also am super passionate about renewable clean energy technology.
Well, I know everyone's going to be excited to have us back, especially you, Stephanie, because that's all I hear anytime anyone talks about the Growthbusters podcast is they talk about what a great decision it was to invite Stephanie to join the team. So thanks for coming back.
Oh, gosh. Well, that's very nice. I think it's just because I put up with your dad jokes, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. We took a break while I ran for president, and hopefully that is not news to you that I ran for president. I suppose it could almost be because the Growthbusters Project is nonprofit, so I couldn't really use the Growthbusters Project to promote my candidacy for president. That's one reason why we kind of went dark with this podcast, was that we couldn't talk about what was on our minds, which was Dave Gardner running for president. So we took a break. I think our last podcast was really only 9 months ago, and that's only because we had a guest host, and I want to really give a big nod and round of applause to Terry Spahr for guest hosting episode 84, Strong Economy Begins with Shrinking Workforce. That was a pretty neat podcast, and we kind of put out the word that anybody who wanted to guest host while Dave and Stephanie were taking a break could reach out to us, and we would help them get an episode published. But Terry was the only one who was able to carry that football all the way across the goal line.
Well, we're really appreciative of Terry and the listeners for waiting and joining us again, hopefully, as we get this back up and running.
Yeah. I'll put a link in the show notes to that episode in case you're not listening just on your podcast app on your smartphone. We're back now. If you missed the campaign, and you may have, because it didn't seem like we attracted a huge gathering over there, you can certainly catch up on that. You can listen to or view on YouTube the Dave the Planet podcast, or you can go to Substack and look for Dave the Planet and read the column that I started and continued during the presidential campaign. I don't want to talk too much about the campaign, but let's do kind of a quick little postmortem. We actually did somewhat of a postmortem in the last episode of the Dave the Planet podcast, which we stood up a little more than a year ago and did what was probably the last episode just a few weeks ago. So you might want to listen to that or watch that as well for maybe a deeper dive into what we learned from the campaign. I ran, some people think that was silly to run. I didn't have a long career in politics, didn't have a lot of money, didn't have a political party. No party would have me based on the platform that I wanted to advance, so it seemed kind of silly to a lot of people. But I decided to run because no one's telling the public the truth. We needed someone to tell the public the truth. And that's what we're doing here on the Growthbusters podcast in every episode. But, we have a limited audience, and I thought maybe a presidential candidate talking about these things would be more newsworthy, and it would be a way for us to get beyond the choir. If you're listening to this podcast, well, congratulations, you probably made the choir. probably a member of the choir. Although if you're doing your job as an activist and helping to spread the word, then maybe your friends, relatives, the billionaire down the street or somebody like that is listening too. And if you're one of those people, you're not in the choir, so welcome, and we'll try to give you a little bit of religion. So the basic truths that I wanted to share with the public were, one, we are in a state of emergency, an ecological overshoot emergency. And if you're not fully familiar with ecological overshoot, and that would mean you're one of the 98% of people in the world, probably, maybe 99.5%. We're not going to give you the class here today, but you can go back and listen to Welcome to Overshoot. Have a nice day. I think we've published that as an episode of the Growth Busters podcast. It was originally an episode of the Conversation Earth syndicated radio series and podcast. So there's a couple places that you could look for that. And that's a good way to spend I think it was just a half hour and get a primer on ecological overshoot. So anyway, we thought there'd be some value to having a presidential candidate who was running with the promise to, number one, declare an ecological overshoot emergency, and then promise to lead the country and even the world on an effort to get out of overshoot, which meant curb our overconsumption, contract our economy instead of continuing to grow it, and contract our population and really celebrate the declining birth rates that are already the major trend around the world. Like I said, I thought a candidate making those kind of promises would really attract attention. But I have to say, I really think the news media failed us. They failed us during the election by not covering this candidate who had such a bold agenda. But they've also failed us over the years by not covering this subject appropriately, and especially in terms of both population growth and economic growth. Every quarter in the United States, we get an estimate of the GDP growth for the last quarter. That's gross domestic product. That's economic growth. And in all the mainstream media, virtually every news report that you can find about that figure, there's never any mention of the fact that there is I guess right now we'd have to call it a contrarian view. You know, what's the other side of the story? Everybody's celebrating if there's rapid growth, and they never reach out to and talk to significant experts out there who would be the first to tell us we shouldn't be celebrating that growth. The planet cannot continue to meet our needs if we keep on growing the economy. But they never even allude to the possibility that economic growth isn't good news, and they never reach out to really sound ecological economists and other experts to let them share their view. So that's another area where the news media are just completely failing us. So I didn't want this episode to go by without scolding journalists a little bit in that department.
Yeah, and I know we're going to get into the presidential election that we did see come through the mainstream media. We'll talk more in depth about this, but I think this was the prime election to actually bring those topics up because they were not being covered in either of the major party candidates' campaigns at all. They were blatantly missing. And so this was a good opportunity to focus on a candidate like Dave Gardner, Dave the Planet.
Yeah, and another thing, it did seem like the right time. Well, one reason it seemed like the right time is because we're running out of time.
Yeah.
I was thinking we can't afford to wait 4 more years to get really serious about doing what we need to do. And I haven't really changed my thoughts on that, but that was part of the drive to go ahead and run for president. And one of the reasons why I didn't say, well, maybe I should run for Congress and serve in Congress for 8 years and serve as a governor for 8 years and then finally be president. We didn't have time for me to follow one of those tracks. And that was one of the criticisms I got out there as well. Geez, who do you think you are to just come out of nowhere and think that you can run for president? Well, I could, and I did, but didn't have much success at it, clearly. The other thing that I think hurt the campaign, kept the campaign from really gathering the following that it needed to get attention, was a lot of concern about being a spoiler. I think more concern than most elections, because there were a significant number of people, apparently not quite 51%, of the voters out there who really were nervous about the possibility of an indecent, incompetent criminal being returned to the White House. So we got that a lot. A lot of people who thought that there was some importance in the message that the Dave the Planet campaign was advancing, they didn't want to donate. They didn't want to really give us any oxygen because they were afraid any vote taken away from the one candidate who had a chance of defeating Donald Trump would be a mistake. And it turned out, certainly Kamala Harris needed every vote. And one of the things I did, Stephanie, was fairly early on, I said, listen, I promise I will not be a spoiler. If I need to drop out of the race, I will. I'll do whatever I have to do to make sure that Donald Trump isn't elected. However, I said we really need me to be elected. If you really want your kids to inherit a healthy planet and to have a chance to live decent lives, I'm the only candidate who offered that promise. Whoever the Democratic candidate was going to be, and originally during my campaign, we didn't know. It was assumed that was going to be Joe Biden, probably. And then even once it was turned over to Kamala Harris, many of us know that wasn't going to be enough to save the planet. We needed to Dave the planet. So we didn't succeed at getting the word out because we really needed social media to take off or for the news media to give us more coverage. And I was counting on that spark from the news media to help get the word out just enough that we would have the donation revenue that we needed so that we could spend a little bit of money boosting posts in social media and, escape the pull of gravity and into the world of actually being noticed and making a difference. But we didn't get that spark because there was one news story.
Well, Dad, you just needed to be a billionaire so you could have self-funded your campaign and, done all the advertising you wanted to do.
Absolutely.
So maybe next time around, that's the strategy.
Imagine if Elon Musk understood ecological overshoot and really wanted all of his children to
all 9 of them
to live on a healthy planet rather than Mars.
Yeah.
His plan is, trash this planet, escape to Mars. Sadly, Mars is just not that attractive a place to live. Now, we can't all go there. We're recording this episode on November 9th, just 4 days after the election in the United States. That stunned many of us because I think a lot of us had come to believe that Kamala Harris had a real chance. And some of us hoped, speak for myself, I really truly hoped that there might be a surprising landslide win for Kamala Harris, which would be a resounding defeat for Donald Trump and a return to decency and integrity and respect for other people and respect for the law. But we didn't get that.
Nope, we got quite the opposite, didn't we?
Yeah. Why do you think that happened?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm sure all of us have been reading all of the op-eds and analysis after the fact, trying to make sense of what we witnessed this week. I think the House of Representatives, whether or not the Democratic Party will have a majority, is still up in the air. So we're still not even quite sure how dire the next at least 2 years is going to be. I guess my take after reading through, and I know we're going to highlight some great analysis for our listeners too, is that there wasn't the turnout. It seems like the overall numbers of people that turned out for this election in general was lower than last time, and especially lower for Kamala Harris compared to Donald Trump. So the Democratic Party is really not connecting to the people it needs to connect to. It's moving further away from its base, and I think that there's quite a few issues. I'm sure that ecological overshoot or climate change is one of those issues. It's almost like they tried to appeal to Trump's base, and that just wasn't ever going to work. They really needed to bring out the Democratic base, and it's a weird time. The world is not looking great, and we didn't hear a plan for how we're going to get out of this, how we're going to be hopeful, how we're going to be better global citizens. It just felt like kind of a dud in retrospect.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges, and we might talk more about this later, is one of the challenges is this need to be a centrist.
I think that failed miserably.
Yeah. But the truth is that what we really need doesn't fall anywhere on the spectrum between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. There's no modest, centrist, compromising solution to the problems that we all have. But no candidate other than Dave Gardner could articulate that. They didn't dare articulate that because it would have been swinging for the fences. It would have been a long shot that the public would say, wow, okay, I get it. I understand now. Yeah, let's vote in a way that seems against our short-term interests. Let's vote against cheap gas would be one example. We needed a candidate who was going to go out there and say, you know what, cheap gas is not the answer.
Yeah, and voting against ordering whatever next thing you need off Amazon in the click of a button.
Yeah.
I think people have gotten extremely spoiled. And I think to a large degree, advertising and social media and lack of community, I think there's a big psychological reason behind this as well that could be explored.
Yeah.
Our culture. I think I'm just feeling like, wow, what is the American culture now? What does that say about us? How has our culture changed over time, and why is that? And what does that mean for the future?
Well, since you bring it up, let's talk about people's discontent. I think Donald Trump still represents an outsider and attracted a lot of votes from people who felt just disenchanted with the status quo. And I think part of it was, you talked about us being spoiled, and I think we are. Is it really a story that we are struggling because of inflation, that we're struggling because the cost of living has gotten too high? Well, I'm sure there are people at or below the poverty level who really are struggling. But I think the vast majority of people in the United States are still lined up every morning at Dutch Brothers to pay $5 for a cup of coffee. Maybe Dutch Brothers is a little cheaper than that. I'd never go there. But they're still getting on an airplane and flying across the country to go to a wedding or a family reunion or to visit family at Christmas. They're still eating lunch out instead of packing a lunch. They still have a damn big TV in their living room, probably multiple TVs in their home. They still have multiple subscriptions to streaming services. Life isn't too bad.
Yeah.
It's not as bad as you would be led to believe. And I think part of that was, propaganda. I guess you have to say it was a little bit brilliant for the GOP and Donald Trump early on to invent and propagate the myth that people were a lot worse off now than they were 4 years ago. The truth is, not that big a difference. And in fact, during a lot of the Trump presidency, things were not good. But Trump was happy to take credit for an economy that he inherited that was really robust, thanks to the efforts of President Barack Obama for 8 years coming out of the Great Recession. And of course, I even hate to talk about this because the metric is all screwed up. A great economy, a fast-growing economy where people are getting wealthier and have money to spend, that's the metric for a good economy, the common metric, and that's not a healthy 21st century economy. It's not a healthy economy on a planet that you've outgrown. But the general consensus is that's a good economy. Trump was happy to take credit for that, even though he didn't do anything smart that kept that going. And in fact, he screwed some things up. But he generated this myth that the Biden administration had screwed up the economy, had destroyed the economy. The fact is, under conventional measures, the economy was doing pretty well fine under President Biden.
Well, and if the last 4 years have been a wild ride, right? We had the pandemic, and there was a lot of stimulus injected into the economy to keep us from going into a major recession. That had the impact of triggering inflation.
And any president would have had to deal with that.
Yeah, so we would have had recession or inflation. We got inflation. Yes, things have gotten more expensive. Housing in particular has gotten incredibly expensive with increased interest rates and things like that and housing shortages. But the cost of energy, the cost of gas is super low. Yes, groceries are a little more expensive. Can you manage through those times? Yes, maybe I'm not going to be buying, my high-end product and I'm going to be eating some rice and beans every now and then. But it's just like people are so focused on the ability to buy all this crap all the time. Click of a button on the advertisement, I'm going to buy this new coat instead of repair what I have, or just I have enough clothes. It seems like there could be this ethic of austerity conservation to get through this weird economic turmoil. Yeah, so it's like people are so laser focused on this one thing.
So they were going to gravitate to the person who did the best job of conning them into thinking that that was going to change if they voted for that candidate, Donald Trump in this case. And it would just be too hard for a candidate to tell the people the truth. And the truth is that if we get cheaper groceries, if we get cheaper gas under Donald Trump, that those will be short-term things and that we will pay a high price for them in the long run. That your generation, Stephanie, will pay a high price because cheaper gas means we're pumping more fossil fuels, not less, out of the ground. And it also encourages us to burn more fossil fuels. And that's a dead planet path. That's not a healthy planet path to the future. But that's what people are going to vote for because they don't know any better. I'd like to think that if people really understood, they would want to be good ancestors. Because I think the most common value all of us have, everyone who's a parent has, is that we would take a bullet for our kids. We would do anything for our kids. So wouldn't we suffer expensive gas? Wouldn't we want to pay agricultural workers and servers a decent living wage and have a healthier civil society so that our kids can live prosperous, good lives with needs met? Wouldn't we be willing to do what seems like a sacrifice, pay more for a gallon of gas, if we understood the consequences of having cheap gas? I'd like to think that we would, but nobody knows. Too few know that we're an ecological overshoot. Don't remember Kamala Harris talking about that even. Don't remember RFK Jr. talking about that. Certainly Donald Trump wasn't talking about that. So we had this outsider, Donald Trump, and enough people were unhappy with the status quo. And really, that's a little bit of a long-term story. It isn't just the inflation of the last 4 years. The fact is, Stephanie, that there hasn't been much wage growth since the 1970s. Since the 1970s, wealth has been accumulating to the 1%ers. The top 1% wages have grown 138%, while the bottom 90% wages have grown just 15%. And CEO pay? 1,322% growth. And just increasing corporate control of everything. I think over the long haul, everybody's unhappy over that. Now, there again, the real good long-term answer isn't for everybody to be making a lot more money. But that's the only message that's going to get through, uttered by some candidate who's going to get elected.
Well, and I think this goes back to the culture piece. We are now idolizing the mega wealthy instead of idolizing a community where everyone has their needs met and there isn't this huge wealth gap and this feeling of being left behind and knowing that your neighbors have the food that they need, the energy that they need, the resources that they need to have decent lives, not extravagant, but decent lives. And it just seems like our culture has shifted toward this me, I come first. And if you're different from me, you're competing with me and it's not fair and you need to leave, starting to touch on the immigration issue. It's just, to me, it's feeling like, I think my biggest disappointment with this election is just what it says about our culture and what the American dream now is. It just feels very selfish.
Well, and I can't remember who it was, but somebody wrote a column in the New York Times just in the last day or two, and I'll try to dig that up and put a link in the show notes. But that's basically what the gist of that column was, is that why aren't we admitting that this is who we are, that this election just revealed who we are, really? Yeah, that's pretty depressing. But here we are. We're living in a world where, I can't believe it, but Steven Spielberg isn't embarrassed to have ordered a mega yacht. He isn't embarrassed at the carbon footprint of that yacht once that's launched. That Bill Gates isn't embarrassed about his mega yacht and his multiple huge mansions and the carbon footprint of those. They don't seem to be embarrassed in the least about that. And that means our culture is up.
Yep. barreling in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Now, it would be kind of nice to live in a world where if you happen to get lucky or get smart and are really successful somehow in business or as an influencer or whatever, or an athlete, that you can be that financially successful. I hate to even use that term, that you can earn a lot of money by being excellent in some field. But one, you can't take it with you. Money isn't really a great metric for that. And two, we happen to have outgrown the planet. So we're in a situation where we just don't get to have that kind of culture. That's a dead planet culture to be worshiping that level of success, that measure for success, because that just means if you're that successful, you are hastening your kids and next generations, you're hastening them to, at best, a Mad Max world and probably more likely a dead planet.
What if we did things based on what was going to make the most people the most happy? Because as I'm hearing you describe this, it still would be great for people to have this wealth and this success, but are they actually going to be happier? At the end of the day, does that result in happiness? Is Steven Spielberg happier because he has this mega yacht? Is Bill Gates happier because he flies all around the world? Like, all the research shows that no.
Yeah.
So what if we actually were trying to build the future that we wanted to have? Instead of competing against each other, we were lifting each other up, and we were focusing on meeting everyone's basic needs and making people have the opportunity for the most fulfilling life out there, whether that's opportunities for education, creativity, and that's kind of the message that I don't feel like either major political party is voicing.
No, and this 2024 presidential election is proof that we are farther away from that than ever.
Yeah.
I was tempted to start singing fairy tales can come true. It can happen to you. But I don't want to call it a fairy tale. It seems like a fairy tale, though, right now in light of what we've just lived through. And I don't want to admit that. I don't want to give in. But I have to tell you, I'm pretty despondent. And it is tempting to give up. Really tempting. I've never been more tempted to just throw in the towel and wake up each morning instead of trying to figure out a way to inspire the cultural shifts that we need. Instead, to decide whether to point my chair to the east or west on the deck of the Titanic, and what tunes to listen to while we head toward the iceberg and eventually sink. It's really more tempting than ever.
Yeah. I think over the last 4 days, I've had moments of just screw it all. I'm not going to care anymore. It's going to be easier to just not even care and to just line up with this culture that we now have. And then I'll have moments of, no way. I'm going to organize. I'm going to get my local community where I actually might have more influence. I'm going to start there, and I'm going to build the community I want to have, that culture that I want to have, and hopefully it takes off. But I've been flip-flopping back and forth.
Well, and that's the decision I face. As I decide whether I'm walking back out on that ledge or staying off. It's a tough one. A little bit more important that you make the right decision because you've got your whole life ahead of you, all 5 or 10 years of it. I hope that you have 50 years ahead of you of great life, but we're certainly not on the right track to do that. And, we're in the middle right now already of this slow motion civilizational collapse because we have outgrown the planet. We went into overshoot back in the 1970s, so it's been a while. By many accounts, it's too late to fix that.
Yeah, and we've sort of talked about this over the last few days where I was feeling that even if Harris won, we are really not on the right path. And we needed to be really turning the wheel 4 years ago at the latest. And I think this would be a great time to talk about some of the environmental issues at stake. But all of the latest reports are just more and more dire. We're using way more energy than we ever have. AI has increased.
And all the talk about all the energy AI is going to need, and there's no talk at all about
Do we need this?
And the fact that that's a dead planet path. If we don't put ourselves on an energy diet, we're screwed.
Yeah, and we're pumping more fossil fuels than ever before. It just doesn't seem like either of the major parties are going to do anything in time.
Yeah, this was somewhat irrational, but I was telling myself that, well, if Donald Trump were elected, we would basically be rudderless. We would destroy the rudder on the Titanic. If Kamala Harris were elected, at least there would still be a rudder. We would have 4 years to somehow get through to her, somehow get through to society that we are in an ecological overshoot emergency and start changing things. But instead we elected Donald Trump. And I think it was Will Rogers who said, when you find yourself in the hole, first thing you do is stop digging. Well, we've got Donald Trump, and we find ourselves in a hole, and what are we going to do? We're going to dig faster. That's what Donald Trump is going to do, dig faster. So we are, I guess it's only an academic exercise to try to figure out whether there was a chance with Kamala Harris to turn the ship. But we don't have Harris, we have Trump, so
it's quite dire.
Yeah,
it's quite dire.
Yeah.
What's really ironic, I suppose, is the fact that literally weeks before the election, those two huge hurricanes decimated parts of the Southeast. And I believe earlier this week, while people were out standing in line voting, 48 of the 50 states were in drought conditions. We are come face to face with the implications of how we've changed our climate, and we didn't even talk about it this election. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, I think we're 45 minutes into the debate between Harris and Trump before the one climate question was asked.
And the answer was, we're going to keep fracking.
Yeah.
I'm not against fracking. What the heck?
So let me share with you a few of the pretty smart responses to Trump being elected. Journalist Chris Hedges, who's pretty progressive, he wrote, "The American dream has become an American nightmare." John McCain didn't have a response, but he was quoted by somebody, "It's always darkest before it turns pitch black."
Very, very depressing.
Bill Kristol, who was as a neoconservative writer, editor-at-large at The Bulwark, one of the many conservatives who really understood that electing Donald Trump would be a disaster for this country. He wrote, "The American people have made a disastrous choice, and they have done so decisively and with their eyes wide open. After everything, after his chaotic presidency, after January 6th, after the last year in which the mask was increasingly off and no attempt was made to hide the extremism of the agenda or the ugliness of the appeal, the American people liked what they saw. At a minimum, they were willing to accept what they saw. It's hard to imagine a worse outcome." A little later on, he included, "Hope under adverse circumstances. That's what we need. Hope followed by thought and action, all to help bring about a new day for a great nation which has, for now, made a terrible mistake." The White House correspondent for The Bulwark, Andrew Egger, wrote, with irony, "It sure is remarkable how Democrats, 4 years after supposedly conjuring millions of fraudulent Biden ballots in the dead of night to sweep Donald Trump out of power, completely failed to do the same this cycle. Our dastardly elites who can steal elections at will really dropped the ball." Dan Lashoff, U.S. Director of the World Resources Institute. "There is no denying that another Trump presidency will stall national efforts to tackle the climate crisis and protect the environment. But most U.S., state, local, and private sector leaders are committed to charging ahead, and you can count on a chorus of world leaders confirming that they won't turn their back on climate and nature goals." I don't know, Stephanie. I get little comfort from that. I think the heads of some of these big environmental nonprofits, they have to instill even false hope.
Yeah.
They got to keep the donations coming in.
Yep.
Now, here's an important one. Destiny Lopez, acting co-CEO of the Guttmacher Institute on the election of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. "History has already shown that the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States will have devastating consequences for sexual and reproductive health and rights, and far beyond. Should his administration attempt to impose the dangerous Project 2025 agenda, it will unleash an all-out assault on rights and freedoms, using every lever of government, from attacks on abortion and contraception in the United States to reimposing the global gag rule and gutting U.S. international family planning aid. Those are real consequences that we're probably going to face, and that means really stalling a lot of the progress on addressing overpopulation.
Yep.
And women's rights, especially. The CEO of the American Petroleum Institute. Energy was on the ballot, and voters sent a clear signal that they want choices, not mandates. Now, I was really attracted to the headline from Grist magazine, Trump wins, planet loses. They did include in that report, the New York Times found that oil and gas interests donated an estimated $75 million to Trump's campaign, the Republican National Committee, and affiliated committees. Fossil fuels were already booming under Biden, with domestic oil production higher than ever before, and Vice President Kamala Harris said she would continue producing them if she won. But Trump could give the industry a considerable boost by, for instance, reopening more of the Arctic to drilling, and probably a lot of national public lands. You know, if he has his way, they'll be drilling in every national park.
Yeah, the vast resources that belong to our current and future generations will go to the highest bidder.
Yes, indeed. And Christiana Figueres, who was UN climate chief from 2010 to 2016, wrote, "The result from this election will be seen as a major blow to global climate action." And that's really true. I mean, a lot of the world's going to say foolishly, but in some ways accurately, well, why bother? If the United States is going to do what Donald Trump wants to do, then why should we even try in our own countries to be responsible global citizens?
And they have a point.
I hate to say it.
They have a point.
Written before the election by David Todd McCarty on Medium, "If Trump wins, is it game over?" And he wrote, "I would argue that the vast majority of Trump supporters are rather ignorant about his real intentions for the country and how badly it will be for them should he win. They're either delusional that he would actually follow his worst instincts or simply uninformed about what those instincts are. They might never come around to the fact that their support for him is in direct conflict with their own best interests." And I think, Stephanie, that is a good segue to talking a little bit about what Thom Hartmann wrote about following the election, was that this was in many ways maybe the culmination of a 50-year plan to really to steal the world from the working man.
Yeah, and this is interesting because I wasn't aware of this history. I'd obviously heard about how corporations over time have gotten more and more control of our politics, but I didn't really know the backstory here. So this is interesting.
Yeah, so I'll put a link in the show notes to Hartmann's column, which was headlined, "The Billionaires Won. The 50-Year War on Democracy That Built Trump's Oligarchy and Killed the American Dream." And it reminded me certainly of the famous, not famous enough, but the Lewis Powell Memo in 1971, which was a memo written to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and circulated by the Chamber under the heading, "Confidential Memorandum, Attack on the American Free Enterprise System." Lewis Powell was a corporate lawyer. He was later appointed to the Supreme Court, which tells you a little something about the Supreme Court. And he was considered by the mega wealthy and big business interests as somewhat of a prophet. And he wrote in this memo about, first of all, he declared what I think a lot of the wealthy were already feeling, which was that civil society was moving away from their interests of consolidation of wealth. Civil society was civil. We were interested in taking good care of the poor, in more equality and equity, better civil rights, and government doing what the people couldn't do. And that was taking money out of the pockets of the corporate elite. And I want to just share a couple of quotes from that memo. Survival of what we call the free enterprise system lies in organization, in careful long-range planning and implementation, in consistency of action over an indefinite period of years, in the scale of financing available only through joint effort, and in the political power available only through united action and national organizations. He was calling all of the wealthy to arms and writing the blueprint for them to take back society from the everyman. And I'm going to quote also a really interesting piece that I found that was published in 2004 in Harper's. It was called Tentacles of Rage, The Republican Propaganda Mill, A Brief History. And it was written by Lewis Lapham, who I'm not sure if he was an editor at the time, but at one point in time was editor of Harper's. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to this because it really is a stunning and depressing history of this takeover that was instigated by that Lewis Powell Memo in 1971. Describing the feeling at the time among the mega wealthy, he wrote, "The world was going rapidly to rot. The fault was to be found in everything and anything tainted with a stamp of liberal origin. The news media and the universities, income taxes, war and Beatty, transfer payments to the undeserving poor, restraints of trade, Jane Fonda, low interest rates, civil liberties for unappreciative minorities, movies made in Poland, public schools." Basically, back then, there weren't any billionaires yet, I don't think. So the multimillionaires put their money up, and along came think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, Hoover Institution, Business Roundtable. It was the rise of what Lapham called enlightened selfishness. They funded programs at universities. The one that comes to mind is the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. They found ways to take over the universities and start teaching this enlightened selfishness instead of the more liberal, compassionate kind of thinking. And in the late 70s, the Christian right came into the corporate fold. So the result was Ronald Reagan and both Bush presidencies. And they came up with what he called brightly packaged policy objectives. School vouchers, less government, lower taxes, elimination of the labor unions, bigger military budgets, higher interest rates, reduced environmental regulation, privatization of Social Security, downsized Medicaid and Medicare, more prisons, better surveillance, stricter law enforcement. Doesn't that sound familiar?
Yes, it does.
Lapham wrote about their mission, and this really sums it up, and I'm quoting, "Sell the suckers on the notion that their values are at risk, and maybe they won't notice that their pockets have been picked." That is Donald Trump to a T.
To a T.
Lapham wrote, "In the glut of paper that he went through, he could find no unifying or fundamental principle except a certain belief that money was good for rich people and bad for poor people. It was the only point on which all the authorities agreed, and no matter where the words were coming from, the authors invariably found the same abiding lesson in the tale. Money ennobles rich people, making them strong as well as wise. Money corrupts poor people, making them stupid as well as weak." Interestingly, an opinion poll taken in 1964 showed that 62% of the respondents trusted the government to do the right thing. By 1994, that number had dwindled to 19%. These guys have been really busy.
And successful.
Yeah. I think, Stephanie, didn't you point out in a family conversation that there was one poll that indicated that decency was the top issue of some of the voters?
Actually, I think it was your beautiful wife, my stepmother, who
Ruth.
was saying democracy was one of the top issues that people were mentioning in exit polls, followed by the economy.
Yeah.
1 point ahead of the economy.
And certainly I think immigration was probably even more important than anybody wanted to admit. You know, Donald Trump really had his finger on the pulse of this. And, he really stoked the fear of others and fear and hatred. And, here we are. We've outgrown the planet. The planet can no longer provide easy accumulation of wealth. We can't all get richer and live materially better lives and easier lives with everything getting cheaper. Can't happen. The planet's not going to deliver that anymore because we've outgrown the planet. And so it doesn't matter whether it's Trump or Harris in the White House. If they deliver it at all, it's going to be really short term. So people are, they're unhappy about that. So they're going to want to protect what's theirs, and they're not going to want to share that with other people coming into the country.
Yeah, and this unhappiness that we're talking about and how we've gotten to this point through this concerted effort by conservative elites over the past 50 years, it kind of dovetails nicely with the piece by Chris Hedges called The Politics of Cultural Despair. And I just want to quote a couple things. And
we'll put a link in the show notes to that.
From his piece. He writes, "The stagnation of tens of millions of lives, the realization that it will not be better for their children, the predatory nature of our institutions, including education, healthcare, and prisons, have engendered, along with despair, feelings of powerlessness and humiliation. It has bred loneliness, frustration, anger, and a sense of worthlessness. Decayed societies where a population is stripped of political, social, and economic power instinctively reach out for cult leaders. The cult leader promises a return to a mythical golden age and vows, as Trump does, to crush the forces embodied in demonized groups and individuals that are blamed for their misery. The more outrageous cult leaders become, the more cult leaders flout law and social conventions, the more they gain in popularity. Cult leaders are immune to the norms of established society. This is their appeal. Cult leaders seek total power. Those who follow them grant them this power in the desperate hope that the cult leaders will save them."
Pretty astute. And, as the planet continues to crumble beneath us because we're going to keep digging ourselves into that hole, people are just going to be more and more susceptible to those messages from those cult leaders.
Yeah, we're going to continue down that path of feeling powerlessness. And yeah, I think it's huge that people realize that their children are going to have a worse life than they will.
So if Trump hadn't been elected, someone else would come along, and someone else will come along after Donald Trump. And I don't know. I don't know whether there's anything we can do to stem that tide. I think that's a question that we're wrestling with. And, the next couple of Growth Busters episodes, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're thinking about doing. We're going to be doing some soul searching and deciding, well, should we even bother? Maybe it's more important than ever that we do them. Maybe not.
Maybe it's pointless.
You'll have to tune in to the next episode to find out. So, what a happy ending.
I feel so optimistic and hopeful, Dad.
Thanks for keeping me off that ledge just long enough to continue this conversation.
I think I'm going to go onto the ledge with you now.
Damn, I talked you out onto the ledge. That wasn't my intention at all. Well, listen, as we wrap up, if you think we should keep growth busting, let us know. We really need your support. So visit growthbusters.org and click on that donate button at the top, or go straight to growthbusters.org/donate. It's getting toward the end of the year. Everybody's thinking about charitable giving. This is the most important cause, seriously.
Absolutely.
So steer a little bit our way and convince me to stay off that ledge and get Stephanie back in.
Safely inside.
Yeah. But also you can do some good by sharing this episode or the whole podcast series with friends, family, elected officials, journalists, and the billionaire on that yacht next to yours.
And we do really appreciate getting feedback. So I can't remember our email address. Maybe you can share that.
I believe it's podcast@growthbusters.org.
I know everyone out there is grappling with what this election means for the future of our nation and the planet. So I think it would be great if we could carve out a few minutes of the next episode to read some of the most cogent comments that we get from listeners.
That's an idea. And you know what? If you want us to play your comment, you can call and leave us a voice message, and we'll play the best of them on the next episode. Call 719-402-1400. 719-402-1400. Thank you.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for. But not me, I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us, we are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters. Whoa.